I'm Jason Sexton, and this presentation is titled Borders, Citizenship in California. It's part of the 2020 Missiology Lectures at Fuller Theological Seminary and a conference entitled Migration, Transnationalism, and Faith in Missiological Perspective, Los Angeles as a Global Crossroads. Malcolm Margolin, founder of one of California's most important independent publishing houses, Heyday Books, has reckoned that California borders are as arbitrary as they come. Regarding their origin, he states, in 1849, a bunch of alcoholics sitting around a table in Monterey drew some lines around a map through places that they'd never been and created this thing called California, and we've been stuck with it ever since. It's not real. It's not real. In no way does it conform to geography, culture, or anything else in the real world. Now, while the very mention of California creates a bona fide tension between the real and the imagined, it's true that the borders of California as a socio-political entity, admitted as the 31st State of the Union on September 9th, 1850, are very real. Inebriated as the Monterey Commission architects may have been, they knew they had to present something relatively manageable, which California had been anything but during the preceding century. In the Spanish colonial period, California actually consisted of two provinces, Baja California, present-day Baja, Mexico, and Alta California, present-day California. The mission system established by the Franciscans during this time, which ran from Mission San Diego de Acala to Mission San Francisco Solano and Sonoma, constituted the social spine of the current state. The place transitioned from Spanish rule to becoming a relatively unstable Mexican province from 1821 to 1846. During its Mexican period, California became both more Pacific-oriented and foreigner-settled, though. After which the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848 allowed the Americans to occupy it. After several battles took place late 1846 during the weeks and months that drew an end to Mexico's grip on California, Los Angeles was the site where U.S. Captain John C. Fremont received terms of surrender from Mexican Governor Pio Pico's officers. The surrender was made official January 13, 1847, in what became known as the Treaty of Cahuenga, signed at the Cahuenga Pass Rancho, securing the end of the Mexican Californios' armed resistance in Alta California. It took another year for the war to fully end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo in Mexico City on February 2, 1848, signed just 9 days after James Marshall found gold on the American River at Coloma, Northern California, when David Kippen says Mexico was the richest country in the world and didn't know it. A leaky and informal relationship remained between countries, with the 1849 California Constitution securing Spanish and English as official languages, lasting until 1986, and restricting the right to vote to every white male citizen of the United States and every white male citizen of Mexico who elected to become a citizen of the United States and was at least 21 years old. The California border shared with Mexico came about relatively simply. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gives the specifics. Upper, Alta, and lower Baja California were to be divided, consisting of a straight line drawn from the middle of the Rio Gila, where it unites with the Colorado, to a point on the coast, straight across, of the Pacific Ocean, distant 1 marine league due south of the southernmost point of the port of San Diego. In doing this, the U.S. secured San Diego. Mexico kept Baja. On the north, California borders demarcate from Oregon along the 42nd parallel, since California is not Oregon. And then with California's southeasternmost border running straight up the Colorado River, the California border designated by the 1849 Monterey Commission basically drew a line in the sand, going from where the 35th parallel intersects with the Colorado River to where the 39th and 120th parallels meet right in the center of Lake Tahoe. At which point the 120th parallel shoots up to the 42nd, Oregon, including the Sierra within its boundaries. Now, the state's borders are straightforward today, the cities are a different situation. This is fine, except for how much these change, both historically and ongoingly. With more inclusive flair, the late California historian Kevin Starr would often close out the prefaces of his books by identifying his location as Los Angeles, Sacramento, and San Francisco. About this tri-city dwelling, which disrupts any narrative of a self-contained city, not to mention a city's dependence on its hinterlands, Kevin Starr would often note the appropriateness of the triangulation, since he claimed he lived in a city called California. Disrupting narratives is what California does. It's not so much a place that people pass through, although they do, as it is one they locate as a destination point, or a point of termination, a terminus cupiditatis, terminus of desire. And here is often where it just so happens that eager seekers often never arrive at their desired destination and often never find what they're looking for. They often find other things, whether they want to see them or not. We consider Los Angeles as an Asian place. In fact, it's the Asian American capital of the United States, with some 1.5 million strong and counting. This is not only what the data reveals today, but was often the historical experiences of travelers headed west, only to find that they had arrived at the edge of the East, where worlds collide. Or else they find a place on fire. In her reflections on the writings of Nathaniel West, the 1965 Watts riots, and the violence and unpredictability of the Santa Ana winds, the writer Joan Didion described the city burning as Los Angeles' deepest image, accentuating the impermanence and unreliability of life in LA. While we can certainly acknowledge that LA consumes, LA also endures. A real city. After the fire, rain, floods, and earthquakes, Los Angeles buds and blooms. As with the vast array of native plants in our region, from the coastal golden bush and bush sunflower to the seacliff buckwheat, California aster, and with the sweet fragrance of a variety of sages, to the fuchsia flowering gooseberry, to the California sagebrush, LA blooms year-round in this semi-arid climate, awakening us each morning to the newness of this fragrant and delicate coastal basin. LA will bloom again and again, adopting and integrating even foreign flora and fauna, unless we overdraw the richness of its resources, turning it barren through exploitation, pollution, and unsustainable practices that wreck our environment and abuse those seeking to make life here for themselves and their families. Yet even amidst the exploitation and ongoing problems that make LA seem like a primitive city, the globe's communities take up residence here, bringing with them the world's rich resources, rich traditions, knowledge, and practices. And by drawing from all these sources in robust inclusivity, Los Angeles can continue to be a place of habitation for the world. LA's truest image, then, is not about burning. It's about life and love and hope. A dynamic movement, ever changing and expanding. It's about making space for more life to be here against all odds. Los Angeles, then, is not one place, but many places, comprised of 88 incorporated cities, all interconnected, including the 76 unincorporated ones. 4,083 square miles with over 10 million people. Los Angeles is California's most populous city, cutting the state's northern and southern populations in half at Wilshire Boulevard. And it's the second largest city in the United States. It's the city of the future with little space to linger in the past. It engenders equal senses of dislocation, however, and disorientation amid the recycle and remake, taking the present as a work in progress, or more precisely, Linnell George says, a launching pad. Like California, state in which it sits, Los Angeles belongs to the world, to everyone, where everyone can find representation here. LA's often morphed and mangled dwellers find this with their far-flung identity markers, derived from wherever they came, with their own nostalgic myths animating their daily mannerisms upon this supposed fresh canvas, where things can change rapidly in the uniqueness of LA's penetrating light and golden hour shadows. Amid the attempts to enhance and appropriate these cultures, the projections are often amplified and rarely enhanced. They eventually just equalize under the sun. The sun has been here for a long time, shining like it does in no other place. It's the main attraction. It gives the place life. It attracted natives long ago, and today LA County is the home to the largest native population, more than any other county in the US. Los Angeles is also the world's second largest Mexican city and contains enormous populations of citizens of countries around the world. As the California cultural epicenter, it's a place of becoming, where one cannot easily remain the same here. Choosing a static existence indefinitely, it just doesn't work. Things change here, and people do. And in this sense, LA reflects a central feature of the Imago Dei, pointing out that we can be something better. There's an Odyssey spirit here. It's more than a pilgrimage. It is that, but more like a promise of space that can never be had in the ways that it was promised. As it was with the early hucksters who hoodwinked the careless newcomers when they advertised land as having water privileges, only to discover that these plots were land underwater or in dry creeks, and land described as possessing scenic attractions consisted of mountains and chasms. The tricksters and liars remain, but before we consider what Los Angeles holds forth and how this might be grappled with theologically, let's not move on too quickly from the fact that once upon a time, this wasn't Los Angeles at all, nor was it la ciudad de Nuestra Señora de Los Angeles de Porciuncula. The land we occupy is Tongva land, although they wouldn't have called themselves that. Later, they were called Gabrielinos because of their close association with the mission San Gabriel, although they wouldn't have called themselves that either. These early natives were a people of material wealth and cultural sophistication who inhabited a vast tract of some of the most fertile and productive land in California. Before European contact, there were some 5,000 people living in 50 to 100 towns and settlements on the mainland and on the southern Channel Islands. The land they inhabited stretched from Topanga Canyon in the northwest to the base of Mount Wilson in the north, just below Pasadena, to San Bernardino in the east, and then to the Aliso Creek vicinity near El Toro Road in the southeast, which is south of Irvine, encompassing more than 2,500 square miles. Never mind current county markers. The people who dwelt here were deeply connected to the land and to the other inhabitants with whom they lived here. The fish and the waterfowl in the marshland, the dolphin at sea. Their exceptional maritime abilities allowed them to be semi-sedentary. They knew the blue jay, the rabbit, squirrel, deer, coyote, the occasional mountain lion. They knew the rivers, every hole in the earth, and the insects. They knew the trees, the oak from which they'd gathered the abundance of acorns used for their meals. And they knew the bushes and the berries, the rocks, the wind and fire, the canyons and footpaths, the sunrise and sunsets, the tides and seasons. And the earth spoke to them, and they listened with a reciprocal self-understanding that marked the moral universe that they knew, in which their morality was interwoven with geography, and they were taught who they were by where they dwelt. And then there was a theft. It wasn't a stealing of bodies, as with a different part of this nation's history, but the mission labor system brought a harsh, slave-like existence that was at least semi-captive, a communal form of forced labor, or a form of slavery without the actual sale of an individual. Amid much debate about the subject, Carrie McWilliams concluded that the entire Franciscan missionary enterprise in California's coastal regional missions was tantamount to, quote, Nazis operating concentration camps. which throughout the entire state during the colonial missions period saw the total California Indian population fall from some 300,000 people to 150,000 people, cut in half in about 70 years, many dying at or nearby the missions. After this, of course, a systematic extermination took place from 1846 to 1870, fueled by the lust of the wealth in the Northern California gold rush, which reduced the total population from 150,000 now down to about 30,000 in about 25 years. By 1880, the California census record gives the total native population at 16,277. The indigenous people in California who believed they came from the earth were deemed primitive. Gente sin razón. As such, they carried values not seen as worthy of being adopted or adapted for the future of what California was to be. In his account of Catholicism in America, Kevin Starr, himself a Catholic historian, noted that in spite of different intentions, they had different intentions, some did, in the best of cases, Spain's colonizing efforts included deliberate acts of warfare, rapine, and massacre, and led to the destabilization of local cultures. But what were those different intentions that he mentions? He cites the case of the Jesuit priest Eusebio Kino, who envisioned California this way in the first decade of the 18th century on Kevin Starr's terms. With the doctrine of the incarnation forming the foundation of Kino's spirituality and evangelization, he hence perceived humans as upgraded beyond measure by the incarnation and sustained in that identity by the risen Christ. This sensibility, this sense of the world transformed while remaining knowable on its own terms. The world, that is, this world, transformed and remaining knowable on its own terms. Christianity, then, in light of this vision, didn't necessitate the colonialist project of subjugation, destabilization, and destruction that was brought about by stealing, but that is, in fact, what happened. It was the destruction of place and place-centered identities that in turn gave rise to racial identities. It all happened with stealing, an act of seizing and removing bodies from the free engagement and dwelling with the land in which their lives were storied and intricately interwoven. Now, these bodies would inhabit restricted space. Their bodies could no longer engage with the land as they once had, in the place where they had once found their full lives, in the earth. No more is the world seen as communicative and animate. It's now reduced to silence and subjugated. Where they once could hear themselves in the land and the land in them, they were now displaced in what Willie James Jennings calls the geographical wound. A wound caused by foreigners coming in and to assert and insist they can see God's creation better than the earlier dwellers could. I draw a lot of this thinking from Jennings' work, which notes that this kind of supersessionism that signaled a kind of eschatological fulfillment that finds its end in a vision of land ownership. That's what's happening. And it finds itself in the destruction of place and place-centered identities that then enabled the formation of private property. Now, this background explains many things today, among which is why it's so wonderful to recreate outdoors for those who do. Once land had become private property, people removed from place, we found new ways to re-engage the land with outdoor sports and camping and desert concerts and all sorts of new ways to connect with the earth and with the sun and to be outdoors once again, to be near the land and the dirt and water and to try to find ourselves again there. And the violations continued. In a place perhaps as ongoingly contestable as its sprawl of diverse communities stretched out and its individual municipalities, none of which have any obvious and hard borders. This is because other than what we see in the vast distinctions between the caste classes here, with their walled and gated communities and pristine lawns, day laborer presence, and astoundingly impressive neighborhoods fortified by jaded security guards and shifty sheriffs, and well endowed by the people who have made these places their own. Aside from these, Los Angeles is borderless. And while everything under the sun arguably belongs here, Do these grand distinctions belong here? And do borders? Borders have an interesting history in the occupied land of Los Angeles, incorporating the earliest game trails from millennia ago, a privately funded Spanish grid, and the setup of the Pueblo's La Plaza as the city center. Land outside the Pueblo was divided by roads marking the boundaries of different ranchos. Adopted under Spanish and Mexico rule, the laws of the Indies meant that Los Angeles was entitled to 4 square leagues. It's about 27 square miles, and they were to be held by the Pueblo in common trust. It's the law. Although when Fremont marched into the city, its limits had not been mapped, which in turn meant that the American grip on the city would be so much stronger as the land was parceled out for the new settlers and for real estate spectators. Much of the survey lines that were conceived by early planners of Los Angeles were transformed into actual streets during the 1880s land boom, with satellite towns like Pasadena and Santa Monica springing up from their erstwhile rancho lands, with then various grids and major streets sprawling out through the ranchos. As streets and several grids were imposed and then superimposed on the previous ones, meaning that Los Angeles, city and hinterlands, would be an ongoing conversation related to what already was and what could be. Extending city services like gas, electricity, and stolen water to wherever it could be was the key to the expansion, especially later amid post-war white flight, giving way then to endless suburbia and what the city might be in its sputtering cascade back into its center through gentrification, and then back out again in an ongoing ebb and flow endemic to the constant movement that Los Angeles elicits. And the city and county have grown with an ever insatiable hunger and with an ever-flowing dynamic of rapid change that my colleague, the historian William Deverell, terms a juggernaut that has not slowed down, nor will it. Even with the various limits, be they environmental or equity or access or healthcare, these various limits will eventually produce their own momentum. But with the historical velocity given for this town, ensuing and ongoing challenges must be met by creative and imaginative coalitions that strike as unconventional a chord as the city's own existence is. It's difficult to think, however, that even the most bold and outrageous coalitions stepping up to handle and steer the gargantuan creature of Los Angeles will be composed of anything but those most interested in protecting what they already have, perhaps creating even new classes amidst the dynamic movement. Distinctions have always been present within LA, privateered and often happenstanced, even as they are now amid the municipalities and 1 million plus people living in the unincorporated areas, often changing and turning over. The city was never one thing, whether juxtaposed with the mission of San Gabriel or Riverside, which is certainly not Los Angeles, or El Monte or something else. While all of this complexifies questions about LA's borders, I believe, there's no question that we certainly have barriers. Efforts to place real roots in Los Angeles are difficult, perhaps pointing to a kind of semi-nomadic effort that David Hewlin exerts with his commitment to walking the city in order to stay rooted here. Marking his place, he does as he walks around, existentialist style, as a way for me to meander my universe into being, he says. We have historical barriers, though, even to this kind of privileged and pedestrian residing, subject to police state surveillance. Ray Bradbury sketched the situation in his 1951 short story, The Pedestrian, which reveals terrors that are only exacerbated against people of color, especially against LA's Black and Latino residents, with removal logic manifest in unwritten racial and land covenants historically, and gated housing communities fortified by the wealth of their residents who got theirs ahead of whatever the next wave of immigrants and refugees would be. In this way, borders, as well as barriers, operate with the same kind of logic of removal and exclusion that's manifest in eugenic practices, in mass incarceration, and in a host of violent practices that Gloria Anzaldúa describes in an early draft of her poem, Del Otro Lado. written in response to her experience visiting Borderfield State Park in San Diego in 1983. On February 2, 1848, a hatchet comes crashing down, severing her body, severing the land. She bleeds. The blood becomes a river, El Rio Grande. They build a fence across her body, Mexico, a wall called El Tratado de Guadalupe Hidalgo. Thousands are sacrificed to that barbed wall. While offering a British perspective to the issue of borders, Luke Bretherton argues that a sense of place and the existence of borders resists the homogenizing collectivism and abstraction of cosmopolitan egalitarianism, whether liberal, capitalist, or communist, that would make everyone the same, and thereby eradicate the possibility of gift exchange. Such a perspective, however provisional, and even whilst recognizing that all our human constructions of place are under judgment, does not adequately account for the history of social relations within places like Los Angeles and the invasive dismembering violence of the action of the carceral state, whether liberal, capitalist, communist, on its residents, and the lack of due process for these residents, and how it enables a veneer of justice that leaves state actors unaccountable for ongoing official state-sanctioned injustices. With regard to the U.S. and Mexico border, geographer Michael Deere presents several reasons why border walls just won't work in the case of U.S. and Mexico. The border has long been a place of connectivity and collaboration, he argues. He argues that border walls fail miserably by encouraging other means of illegal immigration. And finally, he points out that spaces between Mexico and the U.S. form what Deere calls a whole other third nation, which is not a formal sovereign nation state, but shares characteristics of a nation, including shared identities, joint traditions, and language ties. For these reasons, Deere argues that the third nation endures. And amid the billions of dollars spent on the politics of border walls, a far greater investment could be made in the growing relations between the two countries, since the prosperity of the third nation, Deere says, quote, may yet prove to be the most effective guarantor of our national security and linchpin of a humane immigration policy. Of course, while subject to local and county laws and to laws of the state of California and the United States, while Los Angeles is many things, it is not a state. Yet it remains ongoingly contestable space. It remains that third space, embodied in the lives of its residents who come from around the world, having endured violence as often as having experienced hope. In California, borders remain ways of banishing the unwanted, whether into the noir of desert death occupying the imagination of so many Los Angelinos who live on the edge of existence within LA's imaginary fear of the other. But indeed, the other is here, resident in our neighborhoods, working in our restaurants, hiking our trails, fishing on the piers, helping their kids through online school, and sharing our same plight in this current COVID-19 moment, although with greater vulnerability than the rest of us. Here we are. El otro lado está aquí. And the other is us, melded together in the complex structurings of our city, which, according to Karen Tay Yamashita, is the so-called, in her so-called magical realist reading of the situation, her book Tropic of Orange, finds Los Angeles expanding ever on. Not in the sense of Mike Davis's City of Quartz's ongoing expansion of the carceral state with its crude police state occupation, but actually moving. Yamashita gives us a space suspended between places, between Los Angeles and Mexico City, with all its parts and the whole, and would-be residents turned and moving northward as the elasticity of time and space moves with them, dragging along with it the very Tropic of Cancer. Borders be damned. Belonging in Los Angeles doesn't necessarily translate to belonging to the whole of Los Angeles. or necessarily to any of its other parts, nor to California, nor to the United States. And in this way, there remains no guarantees here, and certainly none of citizenship. Los Angeles is a life giver. It's an affirmer and a dream weaver, but it's also a destroyer, a negator, and a death trap. All who reside in Los Angeles, to some degree, are fighting for this place, wanting a better life. Angelinos survive and endure, and those who wish to leave may do so at any time. The land will do whatever it will do, but those who wish to be here should be able to, since Los Angeles needs all the help that it can get. Yet ultimately, none of it will be enough to save Los Angeles. No borders can protect from what will one day happen with all surety according to the biblical perspective, reckoning with the depth of ontological judgment on all things, historical, communal, and real, brought about irrefutably by divine action. The letter of the Hebrews in chapter 12 gives this to readers. If they did not escape when they refused the one who warned them on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject the one who warns from heaven? At that time, his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of what is shaken. The removal of what is shaken. That is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us give thanks, by which we offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe. For indeed, our God is a consuming fire. This passage, this biblical passage, grants not a realized eschatology, often coming in the empty promises of LA's frequent utopian and dystopian visions. That's often what LA offers. But this passage presents an eschatological realism, where the future world is far more real and objective than the present one. The late Stanley Grenz noted that from this biblical perspective, this reality lies before rather than beneath or around us. And it is discovered through, he says, anticipation. Not entirely foreign to LA's persistent futurism, this orientation includes not only the reception of a kingdom that no earthquake can level, but also spells out one having a new kind of citizenship with enrollment in heaven, and not the one that's passing away. The one passing away, it's the one that of St. Augustine's worldly society, flowered from what he says, a selfish love. Whereas, on the other hand, the communion of saints is rooted in a love of God that is ready to trample on self. St. Augustine reasons again this way. He says that the city of man seeks the praise of men, whereas the height of glory for the other is to hear God in the witness of conscience. The former, seeming primitive and short-sighted, the kind that separates immigrant children from their parents, malpracticing existing just laws and rejecting ones that should be, distorting justice for the many while delivering heartily for a select few. The kingdom of this world is not the kingdom of our God. Los Angeles, though, keeps its rich terrain as a place of becoming, less like the epicenter of Gavin Newsom's California's nation-state talk, and more like a true region. It sees the good and the bad and the ugly from Palmdale to Pomona to Long Beach and Catalina as a region more akin to a province, which is always developing. It's much more like a province than a fixed city with anything resembling static fortified walls. The place functions best with the locals doing peacefully and justly among themselves. Augustine prefers something like this in his description of the city, that in a happier state of human relations, all kingdoms would remain small and rejoice in their neighborly concord. This is, I think, the eschatological vision where the body of Christ, through the power of the Holy Spirit, bears witness to this harmony and through its Catholicity contradicts the exclusionary logic of democratic nation states. Utopianism, then, is most certainly to be avoided with regard to how Los Angeles may function in relationship to those who dwell within it. and yet dwell they do in this fallen and penultimate era, plagued by sin. A localist LA regionalism offers, I think, the best of possibilities, though, with a focus away from our social fragmentedness and more toward a less estranged and more local emphasis on our own particular social orders, the way things are here. Such a regionalism is perhaps the best antidote to a cosmopolitanism that puts down no actual roots and thus becoming only a thin basis for, say, pragmatic or opportunistic formalized citizenship. Regionalism instead provides a tethering that enables a flourishing in the spirit of shared loyalty, which in turn requires and rewards engagement with one's particular dwelling place. This spirit of higher provincialism, in Josiah Royce's terms, enables the best kinds of freedom and flourishing that one might expect from neighbors who are building together within a culture of trust, perhaps even featuring the kind of love that Augustine refers to as inherent in the communion of saints, or the life sought after and shared by those residing in Royce's beloved community, or even amid what Ed Soja calls urban spatial causality and its effects in a city region that can manifest the unjust effects of neoliberal globalization and serve, on the other hand, as an active agent for a new spatially informed social movements that are aimed at changing the world for better. Such a position to occupy, requires a persistence and a presence that abidingly resists various utopian and dystopian visions with a view toward an everyday learning and embodying of both LA's particular and generalizable features that take Angelenos of all kinds through the process of becoming more better versions of what they already are.